Uh, our topic tonight is the main topic, Marbled Murrelet research by Josh Ward. We also kind of call him the king of pigtail, because for a while I didn't know who he was, but he did all this cool stuff. So Josh is a native of Howard County. He's been fascinated by the native world, birds in particular, if you couldn't tell from when he was talking earlier. Since before he could even talk, he considered himself a birder since the first time he saw a prairie warbler singing in an overgrown field behind Tridelphia Reservoir. Those woods remain one of his favorite places to explore. Josh spent nearly 5 years living in the Blue Ridge of southwestern Virginia, pursuing a degree in wildlife conservation from Virginia Tech, go Hokies, with which he graduated in the fall in 2022. This time spent in Appalachia inspired him a deep love of all wild places the world has to share. This love has taken him to many special places, from breeding bird surveys in Virginia to marbled murrelet surveys in Oregon, and from shorebird nest searching in the Alaskan Arctic to assisting with big cat research in Belize. He's excited to once again be birding in the mountains he's come to love, this time in his home state of Maryland. Outside of the natural sciences, Josh is a passionate writer and composer of poems about his experiences in nature. He hopes not just to contribute to some of this work towards the conservation and education goals of MVP, but one day make it his career. He's honored for this opportunity to contribute valuable data to the field of ornithology, and welcomes anything the mountains of Maryland have to offer him this season. Welcome.
Forward, backward, laser. Press it again to make it go undark. Make it go undark. Delightful. Thank you. Alrighty. Good evening, all. Thank you all for coming out. Let's do the math real quick here. After 11 years of being a member of this club, this is my first presentation here, so it's a long time coming, and I'm very excited to be up here in front of you all, because a number of you have known me since I was like 13, which is pretty cool. So it's lovely to be here. So I thank you for coming out this evening. So yeah, Oregon 2023, mountains, murrelets, and mayhem. That is tonight's subject. So let's flash back to March of 2023. I was 3 months out from 3 months post graduating from Virginia Tech. I was restless, as you can possibly be. I really didn't know what to do with myself. I drove 13 hours north to get that stellar sea eagle up in Maine. I was successful, thankfully. But yeah, that's just an example of just how much I needed to get out and move around. And I decided, you know what, now that I'm out of college, let's shake things up a little bit. Let's see if we can do something on the other side of the country. So spent November through February just sending out applications for various stuff out on the West Coast. And as I was already driving across the country, like when I was in Nebraska, I had an interview with this position for the marbled murrelets and got it. And I was like, well, wonderful, because I'm already headed out there. So that's just a quick view of the route that I took from Blacksburg, Virginia to Oregon. That actually, where I ended up for the summer is right there in southwestern Oregon, but that was my initial journey up to just outside Portland. So I did 9 days crossing the country, saw some areas that I hadn't seen before, saw some incredible birds, got to watch some greater prairie chickens lekking in Nebraska, mountain bluebird on a old country road outside Gunnison, Colorado, and a couple thousand snow and Ross's geese on the Snake River Plains, which I know is a presentation coming up in December. So I will eagerly be attending that, because it'll bring back memories of this, which is one of the most incredible sights I think I've seen in my years of birding. Okay, so working with marbled murrelets, I worked for an environmental consulting company called Hamer Environmental. Their main client for this project is the Bureau of Land Management. And the whole gist of the project was, we go into these blocks of old growth forests, relatively old growth forest. We see if the murrelets are there. If the murrelets are there, we tell the Bureau of Land Management, and the Bureau of Land Management looks at the private logging companies and says, don't go here. That's the whole gist of it. So, how many people in this room did not know that a marbled murrelet existed before this evening? I knew it, and I love it. That makes it really exciting. So they are an alcid. They are a seabird, so they are in the family that is auks, and that includes puffins, razorbills, murres, guillemots, etc. The genus is Brachyramphus, which they share with two other murrelet species, Brachyramphus perdix, which is the long-billed murrelet, and B. brevirostris, which is the Kittles's murrelet. The specific name is Brachyramphus marmoratus, which literally translates to marmorated shortbill. But they are more widely known, at least one of their great, this is probably one of my favorite colloquial names of any North American bird, is foglark, because that's what sailors back in the 19th century would call them, because that was the only time they were ever seen, was ships passing along the Pacific Northwest coast of North America. They'd see them, they'd lift off the water, they'd call once or twice, and disappear into the fog, and nobody knew where they went. So they were just called foglarks. Okay, so a brief word on their natural history. They're piscivorous, extremely skilled swimmers, just like all alcids are. They diverged from other coastal nesting species a couple of millennia ago. Actually, can you guys hear me okay without the microphone? You need the microphone. Oh, right, of course you need the microphone for the Zoom call. Okay. Okay, so no, it's okay. I'll keep using it. So they diverged a couple of millennia ago. The Aleutian populations up in Alaska, they still nest on rocks. But a couple of millennia ago, all of the more southerly populations took one look at the coasts that were getting a little bit more crowded with other seabird species, and they went, we could try something different. And then they went and started nesting in trees, inland. So that's the gist of what we're getting at today. The wintering birds still gather in pretty loose flocks, like out in bays and estuaries and that kind of stuff, but still pretty shallow water. They don't go far out to sea. They occur from Alaska to all the way to Southern California. But their core range is from Kodiak to Vancouver. That's where they're most common. Down in the lower 48, they are not faring terribly well. The Washington populations are still faring pretty poorly. The Oregon populations are kind of in question. California birds are becoming pretty scarce. The Santa Cruz Mountains, which is actually where their nests were first discovered, is pretty much one of their last major strongholds, along with the redwoods. They can live to be 20 years old. That's pretty rare, though. Oftentimes, they live maybe around a decade if they're lucky. The eggs are laid in late spring. They incubate for about a month. And then the chicks fledge mid-July. The first 2 weeks of July are what murrelet researchers call the peak. That is where you are going out to survey for them every single day for about 2 weeks, because that's when the chicks are fledging and the parents are making half a dozen trips a day to visit those chicks and give them food. Yeah. I think I'm fine for right now, but I should be good. Thank you, though. Okay, so they were a missing piece of the puzzle for a really long time. They were the last regularly occurring breeding bird in North America for which we did not know their breeding biology until a snowstorm hit Southern California in the late winter, in the early spring of 1974. A logger went up into a tree in the Santa Cruz Mountains. He was taken off a limb that needed to be cut. He climbed up, got to eye level with this branch more than 100 feet off the ground, and there he was face to face with this little ball of fluff, which was a murrelet fledgling. And thankfully, he had no experience with birds, but he took one look at it and said, I have no idea what that is. So he didn't cut the limb, he climbed down, and he notified the park authorities and said, I found something weird, and I want you guys to take a look at it. And the ornithology world exploded afterwards. So that was pretty monumental, and that was kind of the environment I was working in. Those are all Douglas fir trees. That's the dominant conifer in a lot of those coastal forests that I was working in for the summer. So what does a mamu need to nest? Well, they need really tall not carnivorous. They are really tall coniferous growth. The main thing that they absolutely need is tree limbs that are about 1.5 feet in diameter that have a really thick layer of moss on them. That is their core requirement. So oftentimes, the only place that they can meet that requirement are in tall stands of old growth, which, as I'm sure many of you are familiar with, that is becoming an increasingly difficult thing to find. The nest trees must be one or more of the following. They've either got to be at the edge of a clearing, they've got to be on a slope, or they've got to be taller than the trees immediately around it, because the way that they land is they essentially get higher than the tree, they plummet straight down, and at the last second, they shoot straight back up and land on the branch. So it's a pretty magnificent example of aerodynamics. Like they really know how to time their flight well. They will nest up to 70 miles inland. Where I was located in Roseburg, Oregon, was at about that 70-mile limit, which explains why I didn't see one the entire summer. Don't worry, that was included in my job application. They looked me dead in the eye and they said, hey, just so you know, there's a good chance you're not going to see the birds you're studying. And I said, that's fine. I'm going to be in Oregon. It's okay. But however, even with that 70-mile distance, during that peak time when they're feeding their babies, they are making more than half a dozen trips a day to the ocean, back and forth, that 70 miles, to ensure that their babies are well fed. When available, this is pretty neat that I always like to talk about, they will use river valleys as highways to fast track their route back to the ocean. So really quickly, that is a marbled murrelet egg. It's, I'd say, maybe about 50% larger than a chicken egg, mint green with big brown blotches. That delightful ball of fluff right there is a marbled murrelet fledgling. If you're any sort of raptor or bird of prey, you'll fly right past that thinking it's just a pile of dead moss. And that's what they look like as juveniles in mid-July when they start exercising their flight muscles. And then a couple of days later, they drop out of the trees and fly to the coast to join their parents. So why are they threatened? Well, the number one thing is of course, deforestation, old growth logging. They are one of those birds that they make it complicated to look after them because they only lay one egg per season. It would be so nice if they gave us more and if they nested in other places besides trees that have at least 15-inch diameter limbs. But no, they only lay a single egg per season and it's about a 60% success rate. Again, you've got deforestation, you've got light pollution / human disturbance, especially if there's like a bunch of people hiking at the base of the tree. Sometimes the chick might be spooked too early before it can fly. You've got overfishing, of course. They can get caught in nets. However, there's a big one that I don't think a lot of people always kind of acknowledge or recognize, but it's a biggie. That beautiful bird right there, that is public enemy number one. Okay, Steller's jays. If you are in an area where there are a lot of Steller's jays and you are in an area with a lot of marbled murrelets, please, please don't be the person that attracts like, oh, what's his name, Yogi Bear and that kind of stuff to the park by leaving trash everywhere, because it will also attract the Steller's jays. And then the Steller's jays will habitually go searching in the trees for food. They will find the baby murrelets and they will eat them. So if you are ever on the Pacific coast of the United States, put your trash away and make sure if you've got any crumbs on the ground that you clean them up too, because that might be a life and death matter for a baby marbled murrelet. So, but that is what training to be a marbled murrelet ambassador looks like. Standing in a circle in a California clearing in the redwoods at 5 a.m. listening. Now, what's great in that case is that for training, they actually put you in an area that has marbled murrelets, which is really nice because then you actually get to learn what they sound like, what they look like. And hang on, let me check my time here. Oh my gosh, it's 8:10. Wow, okay, I've got some time to work with. So I decided that I would introduce you guys, do a little bit of something interactive. I have my Bluetooth speaker here because I am going to show you guys what it's like to be standing in a forest at 5 a.m. and then suddenly hear this over your head, high overhead. So you got that there. And so essentially what you do when you survey for marbled murrelets, I love it when it connects automatically like that. It's nice when technology works with you. All right, marbled murrelet. So this is what you listen for right here.
The mic.
So that is their most common vocalization. That is what we in the marbled murrelet business call a simple hear call. They make that repeatedly as they flutter high above the forest canopy in big wide circles. They do that, they most often call early in the morning. They are most vocal when they are close to their nests. But you can honestly hear them even as they're flying out to sea. Sometimes in the late afternoon or evening, if you happen to be camping somewhere near the coast, you will hear them flying overhead. So that is an example of one of our survey plots. That right there is a big cube of land and a sea of logging land. And so every one of those little like signified numbers or letters is a station. The little white lines are the trails. And when I say trail, it is not a hiking trail. It is a trail that is marked with a bunch of little pieces of reflective tape stapled to trees, which means there is no hiking trail, which means that if there is a wall of salal growing in your way, you walk through it. If there is a wall of blackberries or salmonberries in the way, you walk through it, or else you will get lost. Because keep in mind, you are walking out there in pitch darkness. The workday for Marbled Murrelet surveys starts at 2 in the morning. And just to give you an idea of how intense that work can be, there is where we park our work truck. That station, Station A, right there, that is roughly a 90-minute trek. And that is still maybe less than maybe a quarter mile or a third of a mile. And that is because it looks pretty straight, right? You walk through these trees here. It's mostly flat. It's pretty nice. There's orchids growing everywhere. Then it drops straight down into a gulch. And then it's a 70-degree incline for about 300 meters straight up a hill covered in salal, ferns, and salmonberries. You have to hands and knees your way up it. And then it's another 20 or 30 minutes hacking through salal to get to that station. It's brutal. The naps that we took after the work days are some of the best sleep of your life. However, what comes before that can be unpleasant. So that is the duality of man, or more specifically, the duality of fieldwork. Because you can come out of that hour-and-a-half hike completely soaked in sweat and having been swatted by every thorny bush known to man. However, you can also find a rough-skinned newt on that hike, and then things get better. And of course, you get views like this. I don't know if any of you have ever talked to somebody who's fanatic about the Pacific Northwest, but folks, it is one of those places that it really can't be overstated just how incredible it is. I mean, being out in these almost primevally dark coniferous woodlands when there's a layer of fog coming over them in the morning and you get some evening grosbeaks flying over and there's a sooty grouse booming at the bottom of that gorge. It's hard to beat. So that is an example of the sort of data that we have to take. So we have the area, we have the designation of the block that I was in, what station I was in, and then you get all of this location information, your coordinates, GPS, how'd you get the GPS, you have to provide your name, company, phone number of the company that you're working for, the elevation, where you were on the slope. You've got your, were you kind of inside the station, where the stations are marked with these 3, instead of silver tape, which is how the trails are marked in order to get out to the stations. Once you get to the station, it is a triangle formed by 3 big trees. Each of those 3 big trees has a piece of gold reflective tape on it. So that was honestly one of the sweetest things about walking out there at 3 a.m. You've just done like a 30-minute hike. Every plant is covered in dew, so you're soaking wet. You've been swatted by thorny plants. You're exhausted, you're dehydrated, but you don't want to dig into your snacks and water just yet because you've got 3.5 hours of surveying left ahead of you. And then you see the golden light at the end of the tunnel. And that is a good feeling. So then once you get out to that station, you stand, or if you're willing to risk the possibility of falling asleep, you can sit. Oftentimes I would sit because my legs were tired. I would sit in the center of that station. You sit there, you have to start at least 15 minutes pre-sunrise, and you go until 2 hours post-sunrise. And the entire time, you sit and you listen. And it is, one of the things that we were told at the beginning of this season is it's like, hey, there's a very, very high non-zero chance that you will not hear our study species this summer, because where we were doing these surveys in the Coast Range of Oregon, we were at the very inland limit of how far the murrelets typically come in to nest. However, that comes with the bonus of getting to listen to the coastal Pacific rainforest wake up every morning. So a steady, simmering chorus that starts with sooty grouse and northern pygmy owl and varied thrush, and then the black-headed grosbeaks join in, and then the McGillivray's warblers join in, and then the Swainson's thrushes join in. And so by the time that you're walking out in the morning, it is this incredible Pacific Coast assortment that is just filling the woods with sound. And that in and of itself is more than worth all the hiking that it takes to get out there. Probably one of my favorite new birds that I heard this summer that I got from those morning surveys was mountain quail. And that is an incredible sound to hear echoing across the valley walls every single morning. But when it comes to recording the data, what you do, there's three things that have to be recorded on a data sheet every single time, no matter what, even if you didn't hear any murrelets, are start, sunrise, and end. You measure how high is the cloud ceiling, how much is the cloud cover, can you see the canopy, how far can you see horizontally, how far can you hear audibly, roughly speaking, is there any precipitation, is there any wind, and is there any noise? Now here's a caveat here, folks. If the cloud ceiling is low for the entire survey, if there is visibility to canopy that is not a yes for a majority of the survey, if you can't hear to 200 meters for most of the survey, or there is rain for most of the survey, that survey is invalid and your schedule is messed up for the rest of the week and you gotta go do it on one of your days off the following weekend. Marbled Murrelet surveying can be merciless, folks, but that is really, you've got a very narrow season to survey for them, and so if there's any inclement weather, you have to make it up. So sometimes you are working many days longer than you would expect to without a break. That's just the way the cookie crumbles when it comes to surveying for these birds that are already very mysterious, that are already very shy, and that only have a roughly, in the south of their range, their breeding season is 170 days, but where we are in kind of the upper middle point of their range, it's maybe around 150 or something like that, a little lower, and that goes by pretty darn quickly. So that's just the way it is. If there's any rain, if there's any fog, you have to be honest about it and say, okay, there goes one of my weekend days. I got to go and make it up. That's just the way it goes. But you always take note of the sunrise time. You take note of the temperature at sunrise. You take note of the temperature at the end of the survey. Mark your survey time, start time and end time. Always make sure to note that you're writing down things in Fahrenheit. This is government papers and that kind of stuff. If there is any idiosyncrasy that they do not like, you're doing all the paperwork again. That's again just the way it is. We were filling out this paperwork for the BLM, so everything had to be filled out to a T. On the back is where you write down survey activities. So this, if you detect a murrelet, well, on the back, again, note that I have to write down start time, sunrise, and end time. You have to still put that down on the back of the sheet. However, if I were to hear a murrelet, what I do is I'd write down what detection number it was. So if it was my first one of the day, I'd put 1. I put when I heard it. I put the initial detection direction. So I heard that bird coming from the northwest. So I put that down there. Type, that would either be H, heard only, S, seen only, or B, both seen and heard. Of course, 90% of it, more than 90% of the time, if you get a detection, it's going to be heard only because they'll be flying through the clouds or something like that. So you have to mark what type it was. Then if you did hear it, you have to note the vocal series. What kind of call did it start with? Was it a hear call? Was it a whistle call? What did it end with? How many times did it call? And were they overlapping? Because if it was overlapping, it means it was probably a pair or at least more than one bird. And typically when you've got a pair circling overhead like that, it means they already have a nest or are looking for one. I mean, of course, when you see two birds together, in general, when you're doing breeding bird surveys, that's, a good sign. But with murrelets, it's really good. Like really, they really want you to pay attention and see if they're overlapping, because it's like, wow, if there's a pair, that's an excellent sign. It means they're really at minimum scoping out that area. And that's often reason enough to conserve a patch of woods. It's like, hey, the murrelets were showing interest in this spot. We can't really afford to like put it up to the loggers at all, because if they're showing interest, we have to take the chance that they might nest. So, oops, and there we go. Sorry. So yeah, and then you also, if you happen to see them, you note the number of birds that you saw. You note their behavior. Were they circling? Were they flying straight? Again, if they were flying straight, that's cool. They're checking out the area. If they're circling, that means that they are either zeroing in on a nesting area, like it's like, ooh, yeah, it's kind of like if you're in like property management, like circling murrelets means that they're like really feeling a spot, like, okay, that's really cool. Or it often means that they're getting ready to land somewhere and they might already have a nest. If you see it again, you also want to note how high was it flying. If it was flying below the canopy, this is actually probably the most important detail for if you see a murrelet. If it was flying below the canopy, that is confirmed breeding. They will only fly below the canopy if they are on approach to a nest. So that is the number one thing. If you see a murrelet, you make sure you know how high the trees are, because if it's even just a little bit below the tops of the tallest trees, that is enough to say that is notably low, and that means they are really coming in. They're coming in for their nest. So very important thing to keep in mind. And then, of course, if you see them, you want to see like what direction they initially flew in, what direction they're flying away, and then if they happen to call again one more time, what direction is that coming from? So it's all this directionality, because what you do is if you see or detect a murrelet, especially if you see a murrelet, once you get back and are filling out this data sheet at the field house at the end of the morning, because we get back from work, about 9 or 10 in the morning, you take a map of the area where you were in and essentially draw that information. It was heard over here, I saw it over here, I last saw it over here, and I last heard it over here. And you can essentially draw a map of the path that that bird took, which can be very key for kind of seeing where it came from, what other areas of forest it might have investigated before it got to you, stuff like that. And yeah, just to give you a rundown of what our field days would look like, we're talking about getting up from anywhere from 2 to 3 in the morning. You'd have a quick breakfast if you thought you were quick enough to make a quick breakfast. You jump in the field vehicles. We have big like Nissan pickup trucks. The drive out to the field stations, some were close, some were far. Sometimes you drive only about 30 minutes. Other times you'd be driving close to an hour and a half. Then you've got anywhere from a 5-minute walk, which could be a station that is literally right next to a logging road, or an hour and a half walk that is all the way down at the end of one of those strings of survey lines. Then you sit there for 2.5 hours, 3 hours, because if you happen to get there before the 15-minute mark, you can start early, which is nice. But you still have to go to 2 hours post sunrise. And then you have to hike all the way back out, and you have to drive home. And so typically your workday ends at about, maybe 10 a.m. because then you have to fill out your data sheets and then get them back to, if you're not at the field house where they store all the data sheets, you have to drive over to the field house where they store the data sheets and give those up and that kind of stuff. So then your field day is often over by about 11 a.m., at which point you've been up and running for 9 hours, which means afternoon naps are the name of the game when it comes to field work for marbled murrelets. If you do not take an afternoon nap, you are insane, because then you're guaranteeing you're only getting about, if you're a night owl like me, who would still regularly stay up till like 11 p.m., and then give myself like 3 hours of sleep, then you are like, you either take a afternoon nap or you are effectively a zombie for the rest of the week, because there's no coming back from that unless you get to a weekend. But the other thing they also liked for us to do whenever we were out there is we would record all the other bird species that we heard that morning. They like just having a record of that. So in my case, that morning I had sooty grouse, I had Hammond's flycatcher, I had a woodpecker, I had, rest in peace, Pacific slope flycatcher, that would be weeful, now that would be western flycatcher. You'd have like stuff like Pacific, Pacific wren, golden crown kinglet, red-breasted nuthatch, like purple finch, what is that, lesser goldfinch? I can't remember, I can't see. Song sparrow, western tanager, black-headed grosbeak. So that's the way things would crumble there. The other thing that they had us do is they would have us note down any predators that we saw, any avian predators, specifically birds of prey or owls. And I know what you guys are all thinking. The answer is sadly no. I went 4 months in the Pacific Northwest and I did not get spotted owl. I still have not seen one. I did not see one. I had friends of mine, several coworkers of mine, that would come back from surveys in the morning and they'd be like, hey, guess what I saw? And then they'd pull out their phone and there's a spotted owl sitting 15 feet from them. And I'm like,
No way.
God, I've seen what you've done for others. Come on, man. And it did not come to fruition, sadly. I did have other cool stuff happen to me. I had hermit warblers come within like 5 feet of my face. I had some other cool things happen to me, like red-breasted sapsucker coming like down to the tree that I was sitting up against. But other coworkers of mine had bears run right by them and that kind of stuff, which I'm kind of glad that didn't happen to me. One of my coworkers did have a mountain quail male come up and peck at her boots. I don't even know what to say to that. She got footage of it. I don't have that on. I didn't have that available for this presentation, but that was remarkable. I just looked at her and I went, how? And she was like, no, I was just standing still. And I'm like, no, it has to be more than that. I'm sorry. I was standing still and I didn't get a mountain quail. But yeah, so we would mark down any raptors that we saw because again, when it comes to avian predators for marbled murrelets, the Steller's jays are the worst. However, if an avian predator such as an owl or hawk gets lucky, they will of course take advantage of a giant, fat, fluffy chick that they find tucked on top of a branch. So they like noting that. However, they also like you noting down if you happen to find any other rare or threatened species, which I did. Probably one of the neatest birds I had the entire summer that was not a marbled murrelet was one morning I was backed up against this patch of forest, and at the top of the hill behind me, there was a wide, clear-cut area along the edge of a big, gravelly logging road. And keep in mind, this is very close to the coast. This is not an area where common poor-will necessarily naturally occur. There were about a dozen records of them over the past 10 years in the immediate area where I was. And lo and behold, one morning in early June, I'm sitting there just dead quiet. It's about what time it was 4:52 in the morning, and suddenly a common poor-will starts singing from the open cut behind me, and I go, that is unusual. That should not be here. The furthest west they typically come are the eastern slopes of the Coast Range. So this far up into the Coast Range, this close to the actual coast, it's very rare. Again, only about a dozen records of them from the area that I was in. So I made sure to note that. And one of the things I noted all of the information that I heard about it, so right down to the general cadence of the song, which for any of you that have heard it, it is very distinctive. There is almost nothing you can mistake for the song of a common poor-will. But what's really cool about it is that if you hear a common poor-will at very close range, as I did, they actually have this tiny little pip at the end of each phrase. So it's actually, if you're within like a couple hundred meters of it, it sounds like. And I made sure to note that down. And one of the things that I thought about is it's like, wait a minute, if there's more, if there's more open ground coming out as a result of these logging operations, you were essentially building more common poor-will habitat. And so one of the things I noted in that form is it's like, you know, as bad as this logging may be for old growth dependent species like murrelets, like spotted owls, like Canada jays and that kind of stuff, one of the birds that will very much probably benefit from these big open spaces of scrubby, gravelly open country will be common poor-will. And so that's honestly, I sometimes feel like I should reach out to some ornithological clubs out in Oregon and be like, you guys should be like keeping an eye on the common poor-will populations in logging areas, because I feel like you might see some growth there, like starting about now and continuing into the future. So that was probably one of the neatest highlights outside of murrelet stuff that I had going the entire summer. But we'll check. Oh, 8:30. Wow, perfect halfway through them. All right, nice. That's a nice confidence booster. So, as I mentioned in the description for this presentation, I wanted to talk to you guys about marbled murrelets, but let's face it. When I was a little kid, I always liked field guides better than books that covered one species of bird. And now, of course, now that I've grown up, I absolutely welcome the significance of books that cover one species of bird. I actually think that books that like an entire giant volume that covers one species of bird, that is a labor of love. That was like a lot of research that went into that. However, field guides with a bunch of different things in it are still really engaging, really vibrant, really cool. Like, oh, look, all the pretty birds, all the pretty colors. So now, with that little segue into the common portal stuff, let's cover some other Oregon species, because man, the Pacific Northwest, it's hard to pass if you hit the right places. One last thing before I wrap up with the murrelet stuff. If you guys want to read about this in any degree, I cannot recommend either of these two books enough. The first, Nature's Temples, A Natural History of Old-Growth Forests, is a phenomenal book. I read it in about a week. It's not a very long book. Each chapter covers a different group of organisms. There's a chapter for birds, chapter for mammals, chapter for amphibians, a chapter for snails, a chapter for lichens, and it goes into like how each of those groups of animals has this ridiculous amount of cryptic diversity in old growth forests. It blew me away reading about it. Like one of the craziest things I learned about this is, for those of you, I mean, we were talking about it at our last meeting, the famous little push of yellow-bellied flycatchers that we get here every fall. Did you know that those species are effectively ground nesters, like ovenbirds? They nest up in boggy forests up in Canada, and they nest essentially in thick piles of moss and ferns on the ground. And they require mostly really old boggy areas, old growth boggy areas. So that's just one of the things, many cool things that's covered in that book. The Rare Bird book. Now that book for me has a story behind it. The first time I went to the Pacific Northwest in 2018, I did a joint American Birding Association and Victor Emanuel Nature Tour camp program called Camp Cascades. Wonderful program. It was my first time visiting the Pacific Northwest since I'd been, about a year old and nearly fell down a flight of stone stairs in Seattle. Ask my parents about that. That's a funny story. Anyways, that was my first time being back in the Pacific Northwest since I was like a little itty bitty larval human. And my dad bought me a copy of this book because at the time when I saw marbled murrelets, Marbled Murrelet was my 600th life bird then. So it was a very special bird. And so my dad got me a book on them. That book sat on my 2B red shelf for 5 years. And then eventually, when I went to Oregon to study marbled murrelets or work with them for the summer, I finally read it. And that is as much a labor of love on one particular bird species as you can find anywhere. It is a superbly written book, essentially the entire scientific and cultural history of marbled murrelets as they are known to humans. I cannot recommend it enough, even if you're not even really interested in the Pacific Northwest. If you just like reading about birds, read Rare Bird. It is phenomenal, and you learn so much from it. Again, it was a book that I blew through in like 2 weeks, which for me, with my little ADHD adult brain, sitting down and plowing through a book like that quickly, it takes a darn good book, and that was one of them. So, there's a lot to see in Oregon. There's a lot besides birds to see. I photographed a giant clouded salamander, green and sea anemones in tide pools, California sea lions squabbling with one another. Saw some incredible wildflowers, like that's an epiparasitic phantom orchid, calypso orchid, and I saw some incredible reptiles and amphibians this summer, including road cruising rubber boas in the sagebrush of eastern Oregon. That right there, I think, is probably one of the most fascinating reptiles on the entire continent. One of the most placid wild snakes I have ever encountered. It doesn't matter really what size they are. The females can reach almost 3 feet long. You can literally walk up to them and pick them up as if they were a puppy. They are just incredible animals. And I mean, you can see they're called rubber boas because they've got this really like velvety, soft, pliable skin. And if you see in the corner there, what's so neat about them is one of their defense mechanisms is that they hide their head next to their tail, which looks very much like their head. And so whenever a predator comes messing with a rubber boa, they will tuck their head at the bottom of the pile of their coils and then stick So, but of course, we're here to talk about birds. Of course, I'd love to talk about everything else I saw in Oregon, but then we'd be here until midnight, and I want to go see the Northern Lights. So, here's the neat thing about Oregon. In 3.5 months in Oregon, I saw nearly as many species of birds as I saw by that point in Maryland in my entire life living in Maryland. In March of 2023, my Maryland state list was about 260 something. After 3.5 months in Oregon, I had seen 253 species there. It was ridiculous. There is my top county in Oregon, so that's roughly where my laser pointer is where my field work was, Douglas County, Roseburg, Oregon. I did stuff all over the state, like did sea watching up in Lincoln County, did some birding up along the Columbia River Gorge. That far county right there, that's where Malheur is. I'll be talking about that. Did a lot of birding in Deschutes County. Had a long-billed curlew fly right over my car over there in Baker County as I was first driving into the state. So why did I see so many bird species so quickly? Well, the answer is very simply that Maryland has 6 level 3 ecoregions as defined by the EPA. However, most of those ecoregions are at least partially dominated by forest. Granted, it is forest that, not all forest is forest. If you look very closely, the forest types are all very different. However, the birds don't always necessarily discriminate between that. So it's just forest A, forest B, forest C, and a lot of the birds you have around here will often nest in more than one type. So you've got 6 of those ecoregions in Maryland. Again, there's not too much difference, at least when you first look at them. Oregon has 9 of those, and they vary anything. They vary between desert, prairie, alpine zone, damp coastal forest, sagebrush, expansive marshy wetlands, snow-capped mountains, really dense montane coniferous forest. You've got a little bit of everything. Driving from Roseburg, Oregon in the southwest all the way across to Malheur, you cover like 5 different habitat types. You hit damp coastal forest, you hit sagebrush, you hit marsh, you hit ponderosa pine forest. So the degree of habitat diversity in the state means that within the span of a day, you can cover like 6 different species communities. It is insane. That means you get stuff like this. My girlfriend at the time, she was very much ingrained in the Oregon wildlife photography community. Somebody was very, very generous enough to show us the location of a great gray owl nest in Central Oregon. So that is the male. We saw him many times. He put on an incredible show for us. We first found them because we were searching for them one day in April. We spent the entire day combing the patch of forest. We didn't see them. And as we were leaving to get lunch, all of a sudden we hear, and we look at each other and we go, okay. So then we came back after lunch, and that is when the male flew in. But then we kept looking, and eventually, right at the tree that we were standing on, we looked up, and there was the female on her nest of pine needles. We came back a month later, and there was that little doohickey sitting in there with her. That little unfinished muppet of a being. That is a baby great gray owl. One of the most ridiculous things I have ever laid eyes on. And there was, you can see the outline of Mama's head sitting right there with it. So that was one of the most remarkable birding experiences of my life. I will never forget seeing the male come in with a vole and give it to the female. She starts calling very excitedly when the male comes in, and then starts squealing happily when he leans over and gives her the vole. Got to sit and watch that through my spotting scope for an hour. Just really such an impressive birds. There's only a handful of breeding locations for them in Oregon. Where we were in Central Oregon is actually probably one of the lesser known areas in the state to see them. So we were very lucky in that regard. If you were ever out in Oregon, please visit Smith Rock. It is this incredible rock formation in Central Oregon. So many incredible raptor viewing opportunities. And I mean, the scenery around there in general is just off the charts. However, you can also walk along the trails and have canyon wrens come and sit right next to you. Now, for a lot of people, of course, I'm going to be making a generalization here. For a lot of people who've been birding in the Western United States, you know, like if there's one bird sound that kind of comes to mind, it's probably something like a Western meadowlark or something like that, like a very iconic sound of like the Western prairies or the Great Plains. For me, if you ask me what the definitive sound of the west of the United States west of the Mississippi is, it is that bird right there. There is nothing else like hearing that liquid cascade pour down the sides of the canyon and then bounce between the walls. There's nothing else like it. That I hear that sound even in a recording, like coming off of my computer in my bedroom at my desk, and I am transported back to a canyon in Texas, in Colorado, or in Oregon. Alrighty. What you guys see that tiny little dark spot right there in the center of this laser pointer circle? That right there is a mama golden eagle. That bird has a 6-foot wingspan. You can just do some visual math right there. That nest is taller than this room and weighs probably more than any of the cars that you use to drive over here. That is an enormous towering nest that you can stand from this overlook and literally point a spotting scope at and look at, and you can watch them tend to their nest. I don't believe they had any chicks at the time, but man, it was incredible just to look across and see such a majestic bird sitting on, I mean, that is a throne. You can't call that anything else. That is a throne for an equally regal bird. So that was probably one of the most impressive things we saw that day. Now, if you go to the coast of Oregon, you will know this sound. These are pigeon guillemots, which are one of the most common seabirds in Oregon. And man alive, are they ever noisy. And I think, are we still on here? Now we are. There we go. All right. So this sound, here we go. That is the sound that you will hear at every marina, at every harbor, at every dock across the entire coast of Oregon. They are one of the most common seabirds that we have out there. And their antics of seeing, these are mated pairs that you see foraging together out in the shallow waters, and they talk to one another like that constantly. So it's a lot of fun to be able to see them. You can often just kind of lay down on the docks and they'll come very close to you, provided that you aren't laying next to a California sea lion. Folks, I don't know if you've ever had any dealings with sea lions. Yes, they do look like dogs. Please do not pet them. You will lose something. It's not pretty. They are very aggressive animals, even though they're very cool to look at. Other cool birds you can get on the coast include such specialties as black oystercatcher and surfbird. Believe it or not, that stout-billed, pot-bellied little thing is in the same genus as semi-palmated sandpiper, as white-rumped sandpiper, as dunlin. It is a calidris. That just kind of goes to show the incredible phenotypic variation you get within the species of that genus. These guys are pretty much designed to kind of do what the oystercatcher does, except better, if you ask me. They've got such a stout build that they use to really jam into shellfish colonies. Fun fact, one of my best friends from Virginia Tech is currently getting his master's up at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, because believe it or not, that tiny little coast-loving surf, they forage pretty much where the waves crash. That's why they're called surf birds. They breed on alpine tundra in the Brooks Range of northern Alaska. And one of my best friends from Virginia Tech is currently doing his master's degree studying them. The other week, he took a color photo, or not the other week, like about a month or two ago, he took a color photo of a surfbird nest, which is now probably one of less than a dozen photos of surfbird nests that exist in the world. So he's got some pretty cool research that should be coming out very soon. Now, there's the real draw of coastal birding in Oregon. This is the massive common murre colony. This is at Yakima Head Outs. This is really cool, and my mom will remember this. It is called the Yakima Head Outstanding Natural Area, and it does live up to that name because you can stand from the overlook and look out on the ocean and see gray whales coming by, and then you look down and see 5,000 mirrors gathered on the surf in front of you, swirling like a kaleidoscope. The noise there's no recording that will be able to capture the noise that you hear when you are standing next to one of these seabird colonies. You have to simply go and listen to it yourself. Okay, so I'm glad that we got to this slide because this right here is one of my favorite birds I saw the entire summer. That is called a wren tit. Now the fact that I'm calling it a tit, you think, okay, it's like a chickadee, right? It's going to be pretty small. That thing is actually a little bit bigger than a titmouse, which is a lot bigger than I was expecting it would be. However, they are no less skulky than you would imagine them to be. It took me half an hour to get that photo because these birds are literally almost as squirrely as a Connecticut warbler. They come out into the open for practically nothing. No matter how many times you pitch, it will be a brown blur out of the corner of your eye. One of the reasons why I love this bird so much is because it represents a ridiculous taxonomic anomaly. I'm going to get really technical here for a second, but what makes these birds so unique is that for the longest time, American ornithologists have taken a look at this bird and gone, what do we do with this thing? Because it does not have any close relatives on this continent, not even on this side of the planet. No other bird species in the New World, North or South America, even comes close to matching the genetics of this thing. And that is because this guy right here is a bygone relic of when North America and Asia used to be a lot closer together. This guy right here, his closest relatives, and I'm certain, I have a good feeling that this will probably be covered in the Taiwan presentation that is coming up very soon. I cannot wait to go to that because that sounds really cool. These guys' closest relatives are all the way over in East Asia. If any of you are familiar with the parrotbills, those are the closest relatives of wren tits. And what makes that so taxonomically confusing is that even ornithologists over in Asia have looked at parrotbills for decades and gone, what do we do with these? Are they a babbler? Are they an old world warbler? Are they a reed warbler? Are they something else entirely? We don't know. So these guys represent just a complete anomaly within the world of bird taxonomy. And it's just so funny that so many scientists across the world look at that bird and suddenly get flashbacks to thousands of pages of scientific data that they have looked over and gone, we still don't know what we're doing with this bird. And then you look over and it's this tiny little mousy gray thing that just bounces in the bushes and doesn't care what's going on in the scientific world at all. So, incredible bird, honestly, that is like, in terms of like birds being specialties, that is a Pacific Coast specialty. I think they're not migratory. Their range really does not like go much further than I think like 70 miles inland. I might be at least in Oregon. I think they go a little bit further inland down where most of their range is in California. But even then, that is a Western U.S. specialty. If any of you guys have not yet been to the Western United States or have been and have not seen this bird, I cannot recommend this bird enough. Add it to your target list. What it lacks in general appearance, I mean, the eyes are just like so piercing, so cool. What it lacks in overall color, it makes up for in being a tremendous pain in the butt to scientists across the world. And it's got a lot of character as it scrounges through the underbrush. So wren tits, everybody. Kamea fasciata, wonderful bird. Okay, now some of you, who here in this room has been to Malheur National Wildlife Refuge in Eastern Oregon? Okay. No, okay, so all right, so if you have not, if you have like a next trip in the United States that you haven't really settled on a location for just yet, I cannot recommend this place enough. This is one of the most incredible migratory and breeding bird stop-offs in the United States. Most, not really for songbirds, but for shorebirds. You get so many Wilson's phalaropes here. Every pasture has at least half a dozen long-billed curlews in it. You get phalaropes, you get snipe, you get curlews, you get willets. The wet flooded pastures have sandhill cranes in them. Every cottonwood has its own great horned owl. Stuff like that. So seeing Wilson's phalaropes and breeding plumage like that for the first time, there's really nothing else like it. Yellow-headed blackbirds. Folks, if you have not been to the Western United States and really want to see a yellow-headed blackbird and are worried that you might not, do not worry. Go to any wetland, especially in the late spring or late summer, and you will see thousands of them. It is not hard, and yes, they are just as beautiful as you would think they would be in real life. Those heads glow, even under cloudy conditions. So really just phenomenal birds all around. All right, probably one of the neatest seabirds I've ever seen, no less because they really aren't a seabird. That is a Franklin's gull, very close relative, same genus as laughing gull. What makes them so cool is that they are really kind of almost obligate freshwater breeders. They love marshlands. And I could talk about this all day because I think it's a fascinating subject that in the world of seabirds, there are some species that have gone above and beyond with adopting insect catching, fly catching as their main method of feeding. And few do it better than these Franklin's gulls. If you've ever seen any piece of agricultural equipment tilling a field and you see like a tide of ring-billed gulls following it or something like that, these guys do it better because they never land. They are spending the entire time hawking high above these fields, catching dragonflies, catching crane flies, and the speed and agility with which they move is something you would not expect from a gull, and yet they do it anyways. So just a remarkable bird. We watched a flock of like 30 of them over this one tiny little pasture as it was getting mowed. And man, I mean, I think they went on for hours, nonstop. Alrighty, another little tip that we are given by some friendly local birders. That right there is probably my favorite raptor in the entire United States, and I have not yet seen a gerfalcon, so that is saying something. That right there is a nesting pair of ferruginous hawks. And if you see right there, so that's the female up there, a lot bigger, a lot blockier headed. There's the male, a little bit more lightly built. And that little pile of torn cotton ball right there next to him, those are the heads of 2 of the 3 chicks that were in that nest, way out in the middle of the sagebrush plains. And these birds are just so majestic. I mean, their bellies are white as alabaster. They've got these incredible, like really stout, tapered wings. Their chests are practically barrels. I mean, they really look a little bit more like an eagle than they do a hawk, which is, I think, exactly as Pete Dunne describes them in his book. He calls them like a prairie eagle or something like that, because, I mean, honestly, you might as well call them that. And the entire time we were watching these birds, there was a willet flying over our heads, mobbing them as they were just sitting on their nest. It's like, okay, come on, man. You're wasting energy. They're not trying to hunt you. They don't want you. You can lay off. It's fine. It's fine. Let the chicks develop, please. I had to throw this in there because that is probably one of my favorite non-bird encounters I had the entire summer. That is a Great Basin rattlesnake that I saved off the road in Malheur. For those of you not familiar with the herpetological community, that is probably one of the most sought after venomous snakes on the entire continent because of just how incredibly contrasting they were. I moved this thing off the road. I tossed a beach towel on top of it to get it to calm down. I very gently lifted off said beach towel with my snake hook. And in the meantime, he had curled up into this perfect mass that we then sat and photographed for like 10 minutes. He was tremendously cooperative, as rattlesnakes go. Probably one of the best birds I had probably one of the most common birds that I had during surveys. 5-minute warning, lovely. I had during surveys in the summertime. You know, they're scarce out here. We only get a handful of them in the wintertime. Out there all summer long, while I'd be sitting out listening for marbled murrelets every morning, I'd have teams of 15 to 20 evening grosbeaks flying overhead. They're western populations, although, you know, still very susceptible to the loss of conifer forests. They're doing very well out there still. Declining, yes, but faring overall quite well. Not a whole lot of warblers out there, you know. Listen, in the battle of East Coast versus West Coast, we win with the number of warblers we have. However, it is a travesty that we don't have hermit warblers because they're gorgeous. The one thing that makes them just a little bit aggravating is that they are actually very similar in behavior to cerulean warblers in that they don't come down. That was the best photo I was able to take the entire summer, and he was still 60 feet up a tree that thankfully was on a slope, so he was still roughly eye level, but that was as low as he was going to come. But they do that song in the morning is like one of the like classic kind of songbird sing-songy voices that you hear in Douglas fir forests and redwood forests is hermit warbler. And that little adorable murderous ball of fluff is a northern pygmy owl, one of my long-awaited owl lifers out there this summer, right up there with the great gray owl. These were one of those birds that you really could have a conversation with if you wanted to know if a pygmy owl was near you when you were out doing a survey in the morning. All you had to do was start going. And if one was nearby, he'd be on top of you within a matter of minutes. Right up there looking down at you going, why are you making this noise? And that right there was probably my best friend I made the entire summer. I love making friends with the drab birds. Don't sleep on drab birds, people. They have so much charisma. When I was doing breeding bird surveys, I fell in love with worm-eating warblers. When I was doing work in Belize, I fell in love with northern chiffornis, which have only one color, which is like gray, brownish green. And when I was working in Oregon, I fell in love with Canada jays because they move through the canopy almost like troops of monkeys. They are very curious, they are very alert, and they are one of the other bird species that I learned to have conversations with because I would hear them coming, they would get to the canopy above my station, and oftentimes they'd see me first, and they'd pause and they'd look down at me, and I'd look back up at them, and I'd go, I'd start whistling very softly, and they would cascade down from the canopy and keep me company for like 10 minutes. And they would just sit there with me and sing and forage. So those were like, they're like little like forest gnomes. If you get their attention, they just kind of keep you company. It's like a little European folktale. You know, there's no nasty bad ending like in American folklore. It's nice, it's quaint. You could share a cup of tea with them. Last thing, I think this is probably the last thing here that I have before I'll wrap up. Late summer in Oregon is wildfire season. So for me, with somebody with a history of asthma, it was not fun those last couple of weeks. There were a couple of giant fires up in the Coast Range north of where we were staying in Roseburg. It led to some beautiful sunsets like this with all the wood smoke in the area. But before I left, this was in the 2 weeks right before I left and I drove back across the country, which, mind you, I covered 1,000 miles in 3 days. I don't know if I'll ever do that again, but it was incredible. I've never felt so alive and so dead inside at the same time. Anyways, in the lead up to that, there was one other bird that I had to catch up with, one that I hadn't seen in years and one that I had never gotten a good look at. Going to a waterfall in the Coast Range and any of the big mountainous areas of the Western United States, you have a chance of seeing these. Probably one of the most specialized breeding birds in the United States, and that is the black swift, which nest behind waterfalls, on the rocks, on the waterfalls. We had Vose swifts out there, which are roughly the same size as chimney swifts. These guys are 3 times bigger. You see them flying in flocks of Vose swift. Getting there, I remember going, am I going to be able to pick these things out of a flock of Vose swifts? And then one flew over and I went, yep. Because they are huge. They have these giant sickle-like wings, much longer tails. And I mean, they kind of lope through the air almost like a nighthawk. Their wing beats are a lot slower because they're so much bigger. But yeah, just to wrap, so 253 species, 15 new birds for me. Some other stuff that I didn't mention because again, there was so much that I couldn't put in this presentation. Stuff like mountain quail, wandering tattler, gray flycatcher. I got really good at MPID identification, at least for the West this past summer. I pride myself on that. Blackback woodpecker, northern goshawk, or actually American goshawk, and California towhee. So pretty impressive summer overall. And now I beseech you, questions. Oh, got one here. Right here, Kurt.
Yellow-billed loon in Oregon, that's a pretty darn good record.
That was, so as it turns out, that was a bird that I accidentally my way into. That was at a marina on the Oregon coast, and I found it one day and I went, that's a yellow-billed loon. That's crazy. I submitted the record and I get an email from the eBird reviewer a couple days later saying, yeah, he's been there all winter. It's him, just him. And I was like, cool. I'm glad I just kind of found him. I think I saw, was there another person?
Have you considered writing a small article or a book which is very entertaining and you really paint a picture of what you're seeing and your enthusiasm is just contagious. It's just contagious.
First of all, thank you so much. I'm very glad that I was able to come across like that for this presentation. Thank you guys so much for being an incredible audience. And yes, as we speak, I'm currently in the process of applying to graduate school programs for a degree, a Master's of Fine Arts in Creative Writing. I do a lot of nature poetry on the side. So I am hoping, I've kind of given up on trying to give an accurate estimate, but sometime within the next 5 years, I think I might have a book, at least my first book of poetry out. And that will be hopefully the first of many. There is a lot that I want to write about. There's a lot that I'd love to teach about. I'd love to become like a professor of poetry or of English studies. One of the last classes I took at Virginia Tech before I graduated was called Literature and the Environment, which is a course entirely devoted to nature writing. At the same semester, I took an advanced poetry workshop where I was one of 3 students. Those 2 classes, I had almost more fun in those classes than I'd had taking 4 years of wildlife center classes while still an undergrad. So yeah, there's a lot of writing on the horizon for me. I'm in the thick of writing stuff for my applications. And so hopefully not hopefully, there is a lot more yet to come, just not yet.
Good luck.
Thank you. Thank you. Anybody else? One more? Any leftover thoughts? Oh, we got one. Great.
So your muir picture reminds me of all the common birds we see at Tridelphia. So were there other birds to be found in that throng that you had in your picture?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that. Probably one of the other incredible birding sites that I saw this summer, aside from those murres, is I did another sea watching session at an area north of there called Depot Bay. Depot Bay, it's called Depot Bay State Wayside. It's this huge cliff that overlooks the Pacific Ocean. Great spot in the late summer for gray whales. It is also an excellent spot to observe feeding frenzies of seabirds. And there was one day that I spent there where I looked out from the point and I had, no joke, more than several dozen each of red-throated loon, Pacific loon, rhinoceros auklet, common murre, Heermann's gull, a lot of sea ducks, like all converging on this school of bait fish. So like sometimes the seabird feeding congregations out there, especially in the late summer when stuff really starts moving, were ridiculous. Okay. Oh, I think we have one more thought from Val, and then I think that might be.
Yeah, it's time for Northern Lights.
Yo, yeah, Northern Lights.
So had a Marbled Murrelet been found, how much area of old growth forest gets saved around it? What would be the perimeter? Are you talking an acre or how much?
So I do not recall off the top of my head how big these divisions were. They weren't huge. They were definitely more than an acre. I mean, I think it was a couple dozen acres, maybe. I truly would have to look that up. I can't remember off the top of my head, but I mean, just the general gist of it is that if we did find a grid, if we did find a square that had Marbled Murrelet activity, like confirmed breeding, that would also increase priority for the grids nearby it. It's like, okay, if they're here, we really might want to survey these other areas nearby it, like really hard too, just in case they might check those areas out. And I think that might be all.
So, as always, we have a coin, even though they're not serial numbered, I'll just say this is the 100th coin that we've given out since the inception of the
Yeah,
See the cursor on the left side.
All right.
And
Well done.
all right.
Zoom.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right.
Thank you guys.